Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe to watch our next video. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe to watch our next video.
Thank you so much for watching. Subscribe to Black Jewelries and join us for more powerful.
Excuse me, could I see the watch in the front case? The floor manager turned around slowly. His smile died the moment he saw the old man's coat. Are you lost, sir? This is a private collection, not a thrift store. The old man did not move. I can smell you from the door, the manager said. Torn coat, cracked boots. People like you wander in here thinking a little cash makes you belong. Think again. He snapped 2 fingers toward security. Get this man out of my store. A woman near the register laughed behind her hand. A teenager lifted his phone and started filming. Nobody said a word. The old man stood there, hands scarred, eyes calm, almost too calm. None of them knew who was about to walk through that door and prove exactly how wrong they all were. It was 10:47 on a Tuesday morning. In late October, the kind of Chicago morning where the wind off the lake cuts through wool, like it isn't even there. Elijah Turner, 71 years old, stepped off the number 151 bus on North Michigan Avenue with a folded envelope pressed against his chest inside his coat. The coat was old, deep gray, patched at both elbows, missing a button near the collar he'd never bothered to replace. It was the same coat he wore the morning he laid the first tile in a store no bigger than a 2-car garage. He kept it because some things you don't retire. Inside the envelope was $6,821. Every bill, counted and recounted, saved over 13 months from a pension check that barely stretched as it was. Today was his son Julian's 44th birthday, and Elijah wanted to buy him a watch, a real one, from the company Julian now ran. He hadn't told Julian he was coming. A father doesn't call ahead to give a gift. That defeats the entire point of giving it. Whitmore and Vance sat on the corner of Michigan and Erie, glass from floor to ceiling, marble floors so polished they looked wet, gold-framed mirrors on every wall. The kind of store where the air itself felt like it cost something. Elijah pushed the door open at 10:52. A young woman at the front desk, Grace Holloway, 22, glanced up. Her eyes moved from his face down to his coat, down to his boots, and back up again. She hesitated half a second too long before forcing a smile and waving him toward the showroom floor. He made it 6 steps before Preston Cole appeared. Preston was the general manager, 39 years old, hair combed back with military precision, a charcoal suit fitted so close it looked stitched onto him. He ran the Michigan Avenue flagship like a private kingdom, and every person who walked through that door got measured before they said a single word. His measuring tape had nothing to do with cloth. He spotted Elijah from across the floor, an old black man in a worn coat with hands like tree bark, and his jaw tightened before he'd taken a single step. He walked straight into Elijah's path, cutting him off before he reached the display case. Sir, Preston said, loud enough for the whole floor to hear, I believe you've made a wrong turn. There's a Goodwill 4 blocks that way. 3 customers near the earrings display turned to look. A sales associate froze mid-sentence. Elijah looked at him without blinking. I'd like to see the Vance Meridian in the front case, he said. Cobalt dial, reference WV47. Preston blinked, then smiled the way people smile when they think they've caught someone in a lie. The Meridian, he repeated slowly, like he was speaking to a child. Do you have any idea what that costs? Elijah nodded. $28,500, he said. Cobalt blue face, hand-finished case. Something flickered behind Preston's eyes for half a second, surprise, and then it hardened into something colder. Anyone can read a price tag off a website, Preston said, folding his arms. That doesn't mean you can afford it. That doesn't mean you belong within 10 feet of it. He turned toward the front desk. Did you let this man in here? Grace's went pale. He just walked through the door. Sir, I didn't think that's the problem, Preston. His voice dropping into something quieter and meaner. Next time a man walks in looking like he slept under the Kennedy overpass, you call security before you smile at him. You don't roll out a welcome mat. Elijah stood perfectly still. His hands stayed folded in front of him, and his face hadn't changed since he'd walked in, patient in the way that only comes from a man who has survived worse mornings than this one. "I have the money," Elijah said quietly. "Cash. I only want to buy a gift." Preston laughed out loud. "You walked in here with cash in your pocket," he said, stepping closer. "Where'd you get that kind of money? Somebody feel sorry for you? Did you find it?" The words landed across the showroom like a dropped glass. Two women near the handbag wall stopped mid-conversation. A man in a navy blazer lowered his sunglasses just to stare. Preston wasn't finished. "Let me paint you a picture, old man," he said, circling Elijah slowly. "The way a dog circles something it has already decided isn't worth respecting. Our clients fly in from Geneva, from Dubai. Their coats cost more than your rent if you're even paying rent. They don't smell like a bus station." He stopped directly in front of Elijah, close enough that the vein in his temple was visible. "You will never be a customer here. And frankly, the fact that you're standing on this floor dressed like that is an insult to every person in this building." A woman in a red coat near the register murmured to her friend, "Honestly, he's not wrong. Why would someone like that even try?" Her friend nodded, smirking. Near the entrance, a young man raised his phone, the red recording light blinking on. Within seconds, a second phone went up, then a third. Nobody was filming Preston. They were filming Elijah, the spectacle, the joke playing out in real time on white marble. Preston noticed the phones and made no move to stop them. If anything, he leaned into it. "There's your entertainment for the morning," he said, gesturing toward Elijah like he was presenting an exhibit. "Most value you'll ever get out of a place like this." Elijah's jaw tightened. For the first time since walking in, something shifted behind his eyes. Not anger. Something older, something that had been carried for decades and set down carefully so it wouldn't break. He reached into his coat and pulled out the envelope, holding it out with both hands. $6,821, he said. "I saved it myself, 13 months. I wanted to buy my son a birthday gift. That's the only reason I came in here today." The room went quiet for exactly as long as it takes to draw one breath. Then Preston snatched the envelope out of his hands. He opened it, thumbed through the bills, 20s, 50s, a handful of hundreds folded soft at the corners from being counted so many times. He held the stack up over his head and turned to the room, like he was showing off a trophy. "Look at this," he announced. "Wrinkled bills. Probably counted these on a kitchen table with a lamp that flickers. This is not how our clients pay." He tossed the envelope onto the glass counter, and the bills slid loose across the surface. Elijah reached to gather them, and Preston slapped his hand away. "Don't touch the display," he snapped, his voice dropping into something with no performance left in it at all, just cold. "Your hands are filthy. I don't want marks on my glass." Elijah pulled his hand back slowly and looked down at his own fingers, scarred, calloused, the hands of a man who had spent a lifetime building things Preston Cole could never begin to understand. Near the watch case, a young sales associate named Sophie Callahan, 24, 3 months into the job, stood frozen with her eyes wet. She opened her mouth once, nothing came out. Nobody else on that floor moved either, because nobody wanted to be the first one to speak. Preston reached over and grabbed Elijah's leather satchel off the counter, unzipped it, and dumped the contents onto the marble in front of everyone. A transit card, a folded handkerchief with the initials JT stitched in the corner. A creased photograph of a young man in a graduation gown smiling, a small orange bottle of heart medication. "Look at this," Preston said, picking up the photograph and holding it up for the room. "Says the son needs a $28,000 watch. Looks like he'd be more at home at a pawn shop on Kedzie." Elijah's voice cracked for the first time all morning. "Please," he said, "that photograph. Give it back to me." Preston dropped it. It landed face up on the marble, and the young man in the picture kept smiling up at the ceiling while a woman near the door stepped over it, on her way to look at handbags. A man in a gray suit pretended not to see it at all. The teenager kept filming. Elijah bent down slowly, his knees protesting, his back tight, and picked the photograph up with both hands like it weighed 100 pounds. He held it against his chest the way you hold something you'd run into fire for. Preston motioned to security. 2 guards stepped forward, tall, silent faces like closed doors. "Get him out," Preston said. "He's trespassing. Check his pockets on the way. I don't trust that he hasn't lifted something." One of the guards took Elijah by the arm. He didn't resist. He let himself be turned toward the door, walked past Rakgarv's scarf that cost more than his monthly pension, past the fronts where Grace Holloway looked at the floor instead of at him. But Sophie Callahan didn't look away. She looked at the black and white portrait hanging on the wall behind the register. A young black man in a simple work coat standing in front of a tiny storefront in 1979. Then she looked at Elijah, being walked toward the door, then back at the portrait. Her lips parted. Under the counter, she pulled out her phone and typed something fast, her fingers shaking. Preston didn't notice. He was too busy straightening his cuffs and accepting a compliment from a woman in a cashmere coat. The front door swung open. The cold hit Elijah's face like a slap, and the door closed behind him with a soft, expensive click. Inside, Preston clapped his hands once. "Back to business," he called out, and everyone obeyed, because that is what people do when cruelty is wearing a $2,000 suit and a company badge. Outside, Elijah lowered himself onto the bench beside the door. He smoothed the photograph against his knee and tucked the handkerchief back into his coat. He didn't cry, he didn't curse. He just sat there, 71 years old, holding a picture of his son against a wind that had teeth in it. And he waited, because he had one more card to play, and it was still 15 minutes from arriving. Across the street, a woman walking a small dog slowed down, looked at the old man on the bench, coat buttoned to the chin, staring at nothing, and crossed to the far sidewalk instead. A delivery driver double-parked, glanced over, said something to his partner, and they both laughed. Elijah heard it. He let it pass through him without landing. Inside, the mood had already shifted from tension to entertainment. Preston stood near the watch counter holding court, retelling the story to 3 staff members, like it was a bit he'd rehearsed. "You should have seen his face when I opened that envelope," Preston said, mimicking wide eyes and trembling hands. 13 months of saving, and he still couldn't buy the cheapest piece in the case. That's not determination, that's delusion. A sales associate named Marcus Webb, 10 years at the company, chuckled and added, "Gotta give him credit for the reference number, though." Preston waved it off. Anybody can memorize a number off a website, doesn't make you a buyer. Sophie stood near the stockroom door, phone in hand, staring at the message she'd just sent. A reply came back 30 seconds later. "To how long?" She typed back, "He's outside, they just threw him out." 3 dots appeared then. "Don't let anyone touch the security footage." 12 minutes out. Sophie locked her phone and slid it into her pocket. Her hands were still shaking, but her face had gone still, the specific stillness of someone who knows exactly what's coming and has decided not to flinch from it. Preston, meanwhile, had picked up one of the loose bills from the counter, sniffed it theatrically, and dropped it back down. "Smells like a laundromat," he said. "Bag it up and leave it at the curb." If he's still sitting out there, toss it at him. A young associate, Tyler Combs, bagged the cash without a word, walked to the door, hesitated, and turned back. "Sir, should I hand it to him or?" "I said toss it," Preston said, not looking up. "He's lucky I'm not calling the police." Tyler pushed the door open. Elijah was still on the bench. Tyler set the bag down next to him, not gently, and didn't make eye contact. Elijah looked at the bag, then at the young man's face. "Thank you, son," he said quietly. Tyler flinched like he'd been touched by something hot. He hadn't expected kindness from the man his boss had just humiliated in front of a filming crowd, and it sat wrong in his chest the whole walk back inside. Elijah opened the bag, counted the bills carefully, folded them back into the envelope, and slipped it into his coat. Through the glass, he could see the portrait on the far wall, the young man in the simple coat standing in front of a storefront no bigger than a garage, 46 years earlier on a street corner in Bronzeville. Elijah smiled, small and private, the kind of smile that holds an entire lifetime inside it. An elderly white woman named Eleanor Whitfield, 78, a longtime customer, had watched the entire scene from the cashmere section, without laughing, without filming. She walked outside and sat down beside Elijah on the bench. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I will be," Elijah said. "What happened in there was wrong," she said, "and I'm sorry no one said a word, myself included." "You're saying something now," he answered. She reached into her purse, pulled out a handkerchief, and pressed it into his hand. He didn't need it, he wasn't crying, but he held on to it anyway because it was the first kind gesture he'd received in 2 hours. "That man in there," Eleanor said, shaking her head, "talks to people like they're less than the dirt on his shoes." "I've seen it before, never this bad." "He's afraid," Elijah said quietly. "Afraid of what?" she asked. "Of people who don't match the picture in his head," Elijah said. "That's the most dangerous kind of fear there is. The kind that wears a suit and carries a name badge." A police officer on foot patrol, Daniel Marsh, slowed as he passed. "Sir, are you waiting on someone?" he asked. "Yes, officer," Elijah said. "My son." "This is private property," the officer said. "The store may not want you sitting on their bench." "I understand," Elijah said. "I'm still not leaving until he arrives." The officer's hand drifted toward his radio, then stopped. Something in the old man's voice, the total absence of fear in it, made him hesitate. 5 minutes, the officer finally said. "Then I have to move you along." 5 minutes is all I need," Elijah told him. 11 minutes later, Elijah heard it before he saw it. A low engine that didn't need to hurry because it never had to. A long black car turned off Erie Street onto Michigan Avenue and pulled to the curb directly in front of Whitmore and Vance. The officer straightened. Elijah smoothed the photograph one last time and pressed it against his chest, over his heart. The rear door opened. A pair of polished black shoes touched the sidewalk, then a hand gripped the doorframe, and a man rose to his full height on the pavement. Julian Turner, 44 years old, 6'2", a navy suit cut, so precisely it looked poured onto him, and on his left wrist a watch with a cobalt blue face. The Vance Meridian, reference WV047, the exact watch his father had asked to see 40 minutes earlier. Julian didn't look at the store, he didn't look at the officer. He looked at the bench, where his father sat with his hands folded, coat buttoned to the chin, eyes steady and warm despite everything. Julian crossed the sidewalk slowly, each step heavier than the last. Not from hesitation but from the effort of holding something back. He knelt on one knee right there on the concrete and took his father's hands in both of his. "Dad," he said, his voice breaking on the word. "I'm here." Elijah smiled, the same small private smile, fuller now. "I know, son," he said. "I knew you'd come." Julian pulled his father into his arms and held him there, in front of the glass doors, in front of the officer, in front of the whole avenue. The officer took a step back and let his hand fall away from his radio entirely. Inside, Grace Holloway looked up from the front desk and saw the car first, then the man, then the embrace, and her face drained of color, because every employee at Whitmore and Vance recognized Julian Turner. His photo hung in the break room. His signature was on every corporate memo. Preston hadn't noticed yet. He was still at the bracelet counter with a customer, his back to the window. But Sophie had noticed, and for the first time all morning she let herself smile. Julian helped his father to his feet, brushing the dust from his coat, with a gentleness that belonged to someone handling something irreplaceable. "Did they hurt you?" he asked. "Only with words, son," Elijah answered. "Words break bones too, Dad," Julian said, jaw tight, and turned toward the entrance. He walked into the store, the chime above the door ringing once, soft and almost cheerful against everything that was about to happen. Preston turned from the bracelet counter, saw the suit, saw the posture, and his whole body language rearranged itself in half a second. Shoulders back, chin lifted, smile stretched wide. "Mr. Turner," he said, crossing the floor with his hand already extended. "What an honor." "We weren't expecting the quarterly walkthrough. Until next week I would have prepared." Julian didn't take his hand. Preston's smile held for a moment, before a small crack ran through it. "Is everything all right, sir?" Preston asked. Funny. Julian looked slowly around the showroom, at Grace gripping the edge of the front desk, at Marcus Webb suddenly fascinated by his own shoes, at Tyler Combs pale near the stockroom, at Sophie who met his eyes directly and gave a single small nod. Funny. Then he looked at Preston. "Where is he?" Julian asked. "I'm sorry," Preston said. "Where is who?" Funny. "The man you had thrown out of this store 40 minutes ago," Julian said. "Elderly." Funny. "Gray coat. Where is he?" Preston's smile cracked further. "Oh, that gentleman," he said. "He wandered in, made some unreasonable requests. We had security walk him out. Standard procedure, nothing to be concerned." "What's his name?" Julian said. Funny. Preston blinked. "I'm sorry? You threw a 71-year-old man out of my store," Julian said, "and you never once asked his name." Funny. Preston opened his mouth. Nothing came. Of course nothing came. Why would he ask the name of a man he'd already decided was worth nothing? Funny. "His name is Elijah Turner," Julian said. The words landed on the marble floor like dropped glass. Funny. Every person in the store heard them. Every person understood at a different speed, but they all arrived in the same place eventually. Funny. Preston didn't, not yet. He was still turning the last name over, trying to place it somewhere it wouldn't hurt him. Funny. "Turner," he repeated, almost a whisper. "Is he some relation to?" Julian turned and walked back to the door, pushed it open and stepped outside. Funny. Through the glass, the whole floor watched him take his father's arm and walk him slowly back toward the entrance, back across the marble he'd been dragged out over less than an hour before. Funny. Elijah stepped inside in his cracked boots, under the crystal fixtures, and Julian stood beside him and turned to face the room. Funny. "This is my father," Julian said, his voice filling the space without any effort at all. Funny. "Elijah Turner. He built this company in 1979, with $340 and a handshake from a man who trusted him more than he trusted the bank." Funny. "The floor you are standing on, the name on the door, every box on every shelf in this building. Funny. It exists because this man built it with his own hands." Julian pointed to the portrait behind the register. Funny. Every eye moved to it, then to Elijah, then back again. The resemblance was unmistakable, the same jaw, the same steady eyes, the same quiet strength. No amount of money could purchase and no amount of cruelty could erase. Funny. Preston's face had gone from pale to something closer to gray. "Mr. Turner, sir, I had no idea." "That's the problem," Julian cut in, his voice sharpening for the first time, not louder, worse than louder. Funny. "You had no idea, and you never once cared to find out. You looked at a black man in an old coat and decided he was nothing. Funny. You decided he didn't deserve to stand on a floor his own two hands laid down. Funny. You called him trash. You threw his money across a counter. You dumped his belongings out in front of strangers. Funny. You threw a photograph of me, his son, onto the floor and let people step over it on their way to look at purses. Funny. Preston's mouth opened. "You did all of that in my store," Julian said to my father. Funny. The silence that followed had weight to it. Nobody breathed. The soft music playing overhead suddenly sounded obscene against what was happening beneath it. Funny. A woman near the register set down the bracelet she'd been admiring and walked toward the exit, her heel catching the edge of the rug, and in that small stumble was every ounce of shame she wasn't willing to say out loud. Funny. The teenager who had filmed Elijah earlier lowered his phone, then slowly turned the camera the other way, toward Preston. Funny. Julian turned to Sophie. "Miss Callahan," he said, "I believe you have something the room needs to see." Funny. Sophie stepped forward, connected her phone to the display screen behind the register, and pressed play. Funny. The footage rolled in full color and full sound, from the moment Elijah walked through the door to the moment he was pushed back out of it. Funny. Every insult, every laugh, the envelope snatched from his hands, the photograph thrown to the marble. Funny. All of it preserved, undeniable. Preston stared at his own face on the screen, smiling, mocking, cruel, and it looked like a stranger to him. Funny. Or maybe for the first time it looked exactly like him. "I told Grace to delete that footage," he said quietly, almost to himself. Funny. "You told her to destroy evidence," Julian said. "She didn't, because at least one person in this building still remembered what that word means." Funny. Julian gathered the full staff into a half circle on the showroom floor, 12 people. Funny. Some staring at their shoes, some with tears already falling. "What happened in this store today," he said, will never happen again, in this location or any of the other 41 we operate. Preston Cole stepped forward. Preston's legs barely carried him the 3 feet required. "Tell me what happened this morning," Julian said, in your own words, in front of everyone. Preston swallowed hard. "Mr. Turner, there was a misunderstanding. I didn't know he was. You didn't know he was my father," Julian said. "Let me ask you something instead. If he wasn't my father, if he was simply an old man in a worn coat with cash in his pocket, would what you did to him have been acceptable?" Preston stood there a long moment. "No, sir," he finally said, "it would not have been." "But you did it anyway," Julian said, "because you looked at him and decided, before he said a single word, what he deserved. That is the only decision that matters here, and you got to make it, because someone gave you a badge and a title. That authority is now gone." He turned to the 2 security guards. "You put your hands on a 71-year-old man who never raised his voice and never resisted," Julian said. "Because I was told to, sir," one of them answered. "And if Mr. Cole told you to remove every black man who walked through that door," Julian asked, "would you have done that too?" Neither guard answered. The silence did it for them. Julian pulled a single folded sheet from his jacket. "This is your termination, effective immediately," he told Preston. "You will also complete 200 hours of community service with organizations that serve elderly residents in underserved neighborhoods. You will attend a 12-week program on bias and equity, and you will write a letter of apology, not to me, to him, because he's the one you wronged." In the weeks that followed the incident, the company's internal review turned up something Preston hadn't counted on. 3 former employees came forward on their own unprompted, once word of the firing spread through the corporate offices. A retired Army veteran named Walter Briggs, who had been denied entry to the same store 2 years earlier over a stained work jacket and told to try the outlet mall instead. A single mother named Renee Alvarez, once accused in front of a full showroom of trying to shoplift a bracelet she had every intention of paying for, an accusation that turned out to be baseless and was never corrected publicly. And a disabled veteran named Charles Doyle, who had been told, almost word for word, that his wheelchair was blocking foot traffic and he should shop somewhere with more space. 3 separate testimonies, 3 separate mornings. One manager who had never once been questioned about any of them until a camera caught him doing it to the wrong man's father. The story didn't stay inside those glass walls for long. Sophie's backup of the footage had already reached a local reporter by midnight, and by morning it was everywhere, every platform, every language, spreading the way injustice does when somebody finally points a camera the right direction. The clip of Preston tossing the photograph onto the marble ran beside the clip of Julian kneeling on the sidewalk saying, "Dad, I'm here," and the contrast broke people open in a way neither company statement nor lawsuit ever could have. The video crossed 19 million views in the first 72 hours. Company stock dipped for 3 days and then climbed higher than it had ever been, because in the end the public didn't want to punish the company. They wanted to reward what it did next. Julian didn't stop with one firing. Within a week he introduced what internal memos called the Turner Standard, mandatory bias and dignity training for every employee at every location. A hard rule that no customer could be removed from a store without a documented reason reviewed by 2 managers, and a framed copy of the policy hung beside the founder's portrait in every single showroom the company owned. Preston completed his 200 hours at a senior center on the South Side, serving meals, sitting with residents who told him stories about being turned away from stores and restaurants and schools decades before he was even born. Stories that sounded exactly like the one he'd written himself just weeks earlier, except theirs were 50 years old, and his had happened yesterday. On his final day, he wrote the letter Julian required, not to Julian, to Elijah, 3 pages by hand, and delivered it in person to a modest brick 2-flat above a barbershop Elijah had owned since 1986. Elijah opened the door in the same gray coat. "Come in," he said, "I just made coffee." What passed between them over the next 2 hours neither man ever repeated publicly, but when Preston left, his eyes were red, and he was carrying a small wooden box Elijah had built with his own hands years before. When Julian asked his father why he gave it to him, Elijah only said, "Growth is the only apology that means anything, and that man is finally growing." These days, every Sunday morning, Elijah Turner walks into the Michigan Avenue flagship of the company that carries his name. Same gray coat, same cracked boots, same steady hands folded in front of him. Sophie Callahan, now the store's general manager, meets him at the door with a cup of coffee before he even asks. The staff greets him warmly, not because they know exactly who he is anymore. Everyone does now. But because they learned firsthand what happens when you decide a person's worth before they've spoken a single word. He never changed that coat. He never needed to. Because dignity was never about what a man wears walking through a door. It was always about how the people inside that door choose to treat him. What would you have done if you were standing on that floor? Would you have spoken up, or would you have looked away like everyone else? Take a moment before you scroll past this and actually answer that question honestly, because most of us like to believe we'd be the one person who says something. Statistically, almost none of us are. Here's the part that stays with me longer than the reveal does. Take the long black car out of the story. Take away the sun, the title, that cigarette figure company. What's left is an old man alone on a bench in the cold, holding a photograph against his chest, because it's the only thing left that nobody's taken from him yet. Would anyone have stopped? Would anyone have sat down next to him the way Eleanor Whitfield did, not knowing a single thing about who he was or what he was worth? Dignity should never require a plot twist to be worth defending. A worn coat does not erase a lifetime of building. Scarred hands do not make a man's hunted real. And being 71 and black and dressed like you don't have much should never be treated like a confession of guilt. So ask yourself honestly, the way I'm asking myself right now, have you ever looked at a stranger and decided who they were before they said a single word to you? Their shoes, their accent, their skin. Most of us have done it at least once, and most of us have also felt what it's like to be on the receiving end. So which side of that counter are you choosing tomorrow morning, the next time someone walks through a door looking like they don't belong? If this story moved you even a little, say so in the comments below. If you've ever spoken up when it would have been easier to stay quiet, or if you've ever wished you had, share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe, because dignity was never about what you wear. It has always been about how you treat the person wearing it. Disclaimer: this story is a work of fiction created for entertainment and educational purposes only. All characters, names, businesses, and events depicted are entirely fictional and do not represent any real person, living or dead, or any actual establishment. Any resemblance to real persons, organizations, or events is purely coincidental. This content is intended to explore themes of human dignity, workplace ethics, and social justice through narrative storytelling. It does not make factual claims about any individual, company, or institution.